Uh, general worldwide impact system.
Hi, everybody. Today's Thursday, January 23rd, 2025, and our friends Michael Hudson and Richard Wolff are back with us. Welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Let's get started with what's going on right now with Trump and his policy toward the conflict in Ukraine. Here is what he said about sending more weapons to Ukraine and what he's going to do to deal with Putin.
Could be very soon.
And you talked a bit about Ukraine and Russia, but how long do you think it would take to end that conflict? And
I have to speak to President Putin. We're going to have to find out. He can't be thrilled. He's not doing so well. I mean, he's grinding it out, but most people thought that war would have been over in about 1 week. And now you're into 3 years, right? So he can't be thrilled. It's not making him look very good. Now, eventually, I mean, it's a big machine, so things will happen. But I think he'd be very well off to end that war. We have numbers that almost 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed. About 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers are killed. Russia's bigger. They have more soldiers to lose. But that's no way to run a country.
And here is what he put on his social media. He says that he's going to put more taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on Russia. And not only by the United States, but also by other countries. He's going to force them. One of these countries would be Saudi Arabia. Here is what he said about Saudi Arabia.
Going to ask Saudi Arabia and OPEC to bring down the cost of oil. You got to bring it down, which frankly, I'm surprised they didn't do before the election. That didn't show a lot of love by them not doing it. I was a little surprised by that. If the price came down, the Russia-Ukraine war would end immediately. Right now, the price is high enough that that war will continue. You got to bring down the oil price. You got to end that war.
Yeah. Here is Richard. He said that Russian economy, Russia is dealing with their problems in their economy, military, and their political problems. Here is what Russia's Financial Times shows the GDP of Russia 2023 and 2024. We know that the Biden administration tried to put tremendous sanctions on the Russian economy. And here are the countries who have sanctioned Russia, and huge amount of sanctions on Russia. And do you, right now, in your opinion, what Donald Trump is trying to do, Richard, and what is different from Joe Biden, and what he's going to bring to the table that is different from the previous administration?
Well, given what you just read me, he's not bringing anything different. He's going to do the same thing. He had given indications that he wouldn't. Maybe now he's forced by his advisors and by the people he surrounds himself with to talk in a different way. Very hard to know with Mr. Trump what he's going to do or not. He doesn't think about it very well or very clearly, and certainly not consistently. I would like to talk about a couple of the things he said, which I found really interesting and typical of the United States in a way we should be very concerned about. He seems to think that a war, a costly one to boot, is somehow a necessary evil for a country. I wish that were true, but it isn't. And the strange thing is for an American to do that. Let me remind you of our history roughly a century ago. Our capitalist system had collapsed in 1929. For an entire decade, actually more than a decade, we had an economy with levels of unemployment in the double digits, into the 25% level in 1933. We had a cut in our total output. That is, we didn't increase our economy, we shrank it. We had devastation across the country. And everything the government tried didn't work. It seemed to work a little bit in 1937, and then it collapsed later in that same year. You know what finally lifted the United States out of its depression, that brought it back? It was the war. During the war, they took half the unemployed people and stuck them in a uniform. And the other half they put to work making the uniforms and the guns and the bullets. It brought the United States out of a war. It produced a military-industrial complex that has been a sustainer of American capitalism ever since, even though it is stupefyingly costly, much more costly than the Russian wars ever were, including this one. But the United States seems to think that the war is a cost that can only have some sort of negative effect on an economy. Does it have negative effects? Of course. People die. Resources are wasted. But it also has all kinds of other effects, which American history is the #1 example of. When Mr. Roosevelt took the United States into World War II, he rescued the economy, and everybody with half a brain knows it. So I'm astonished, not really, I'm just saying that. I'm astonished when my colleagues write articles about how much the war must be costing. Where were those articles back in the 1940s? The war was costing? No. The war was saving democracy and just coincidentally saving the capitalist system. Guess what? It's doing comparable things for the Russia of Mr. Putin. And if you actually wanted to know it, just look at the polls. Mr. Putin's popularity makes that of Western leaders look like the disaster it is.
Michael.
Well, your chart is wonderful because it shows that who the loser was of all this, Germany, at the end. So even broader, for Russia, the issue is not just the Ukraine war. What's called the Ukraine war is the war of Russia to undo NATO and undo the whole NATO system. That's what every statement of President Putin is led off with. You've had numerous guests on your show that are all explaining this. How for Putin, winning in Ukraine is just one front of this broad U.S. war against Russia. It's being fought in the Baltics, where the U.S. is trying to get Sweden and the Baltic states, Norway, to block Russian ships from using the Baltics. That's been threatened. It's being fought in the Georgia and Romania, where the U.S. is trying to install client oligarchies, overruling the election. But most of all, it's being fought in Europe. And the collateral damage of the war has been the European economies, as Trump has already described what he wants them to do. And the war and the sanctions, which are certainly part of the war on the economic front, have been strengthening Russia, which is why its GDP is growing, but also its balance of trade is it's now making its own food, its own manufacturers, its own products that it used to be importing from Europe.
Here is Richard. Here is what. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
I just want to add to that. There is something here, and I'm not used to giving this sort of analysis, but it keeps jumping out at me, so I thought I'd mention it. You know, these The politicians of Western Europe, together with those of the United States, are becoming, and I know it upsets them, historical relics. They strike me as fighting the old Cold War as if it had never ended. They learned what their craft, if they have any, during the Cold War, and it just conditioned them that the way you make your way on the conservative side of politics, whether you're in a conservative party or a liberal party or a labor party, you make your way on the conservative side by being a cheerleader for capitalism and putting as much hatred on the Soviet Union or Russia, but you got to put some hatred somewhere. It's in your genes by now. You don't know any other way. So even if Mr. Putin or asks to be in NATO, you can't know. I mean, you're not going to deprive us of the person we can fight against, we can claim is the enemy of democracy. Look how seamlessly the leaders, the conservative leaders of Europe, who used to tell us that communism and socialism are the great enemies, look how easily socialism and communism were replaced by Russia and China, or Russia alone. They need somebody to juxtapose. It's in their way. They don't know how to deal with a world that isn't divided into the good guys and the bad guys, with a need to show how loyal you are to the good guys and how determined you are to fight the bad guys. Look at Ukraine itself. Its leader is a joke, an ex-comedian in what was called, before the war, the most corrupt government in Europe. To make a genius leader saving his people, you know what that's called? That's a reach. That's hard, because it is so difficult not to start laughing at the very project. But no. In the great struggle of good and evil, we know Mr. Zelensky is on the right side, so he is good. His denial of civil liberties in his country, we do not discuss. Mr. Putin's, we make a big deal. It's childish behavior. And in the long run, millions of people will recognize it for what it is.
Here is
Well,
Michael. Do you want to add something, Michael?
all of that's true. It's obviously what's at stake is something much more than Russia. And the important point about the U.S. strategy is that it's so self-defeating. And I think we're seeing that in almost every policy that Trump has announced. It's not only is it driving the wedge against the European countries that are making really all the war sacrifice, but Trump has opened a economic war on all fronts, and the war is aimed mainly against his closest allies, like Mexico, Canada, in the Western Hemisphere, and that's because he can control his allies. That's very hard to get non-allied countries or distant countries or global South countries or the BRICS countries to go along with his policy. But he starts with the countries that are closest economically to the United States. And by pursuing his policy of America first, he's saying all other countries have to be the losers because that's what America first means. America's sort of like a black hole in cosmic sense. Its gravity is pulling all of the other countries towards it, and the countries closest to it are like Mercury around the sun. They're the ones that are being pulled into it, and we're seeing the strains are threatening to break up America's ties with its closest neighbors, Canada and Mexico right now, and then spreading to the European allies, Japan, and the other countries that it believes it has the most diplomatic leverage over.
Yeah. Here is what Trump said about the EU and the future plan he has for them.
Or are you going to turn off the tap soon?
Well, we're looking at that. We're talking to Zelensky. We're going to be talking with President Putin very soon, and we'll see how it all happens. We're going to look at it very soon. One thing I do feel, the European Union should be paying a lot more than they're paying, because under Biden, I mean, we're in there for $200 billion more. Now, it affects them more than it affects us. We have an ocean in between, right? Little thing called an ocean. The European Union should equalize. We're in there for $200 billion more than the European Union. I mean, what are we, stupid? I guess the answer is yes, because they must think so. But the European Union takes advantage of us tremendously on trade, and they now take advantage of, and always have. If I didn't get involved years ago, my first term, one of the first things I noticed was that they're not paying enough. They're not paying. And a lot of those countries weren't even paying. The NATO countries, they weren't paying. Only 7 out of 28 were paying. We were one of them. And Poland was one. And they had a few of them that were paying, and some were paying very proudly. Usually the closer to the borderline of Russia they were, the faster they paid, okay? The ones that were further away tended not to pay so fast. And one thing on that, I think they should lift their number not to 2%, but to 5%. NATO should be at 5%, not at 2%. 2% is ridiculous, yeah.
U.S. President Xi.
Yeah. Here is what he said, Richard, and it's unbelievable, because the policies of the Biden administration literally destroyed the economy of Europe, and right now he wants to increase the defense budget, which goes to the pocket of NATO, which we know whose NATO is the United States and military industrial complex. He wants to increase that to 5%, which Olaf Scholz, that he's not resisting any sort of policy from the United States. He's just saying it's not possible for the size of the economy, for the situation that the German economy is experiencing right now.
Well, I find it interesting for this reason. The post-World War II deal, as I understand it, was that the United States would provide a military umbrella, and that the European countries would not have to develop their military, because they could rely on the United States to be their protector against the evil Russians. The United States undertook to do that because it meant an immense flow of money to the military-industrial complex that would otherwise have been cut off since World War II was over, and you didn't need to spend that kind of money on a war that you weren't fighting. So you had a new kind of war, the Cold War, and the role of Europe as the great front line, the way Michael just said, or no, as Trump just said, the countries closest to Russia were at risk, blah, blah, blah. And so we would do that. And what this allowed the Europeans to do was to reposition their conservatives into power. How? Because the money that the conservatives didn't have to spend on military, they could spend on making themselves rich, but also funding a welfare state, which they had to do because otherwise their own people would have made a revolution. Particularly, let's remember, after World War II, communists were in the cabinet and the government in France and Italy, and that whole resistance against the Nazis was led by socialists and communists, etc., etc. So you had to make a deal here that this was very dangerous. So that was the deal. They'd buy off their own people with a welfare state. By the way, one more generous than anything the United States was willing to do, and that has been true ever since to this day. So for Mr. Trump to tell them, I'm going to hit you with a tariff, and I'm going to press you to spend 5% rather than 2%, which is sort of what they were doing, where's that going to come from? Either the people who run the society will have to take the wealth away from the rich, which they can't do because that's their only real support, or they'll have to cut the welfare program. And with the size of the left in their countries and the size now of the right, they can't do that. That's their political undoing. So he's putting them in an impossible position. By the way, the same applies to Mexico. If he in fact deports millions of people, which he says he's going to do, and he puts a tariff on Mexican goods coming into the US, which he says he's going to do. Let's very briefly be clear. That means millions of people without work coming into Mexico looking for jobs. The tariffs, by cutting off a part of their export market, the US is the largest market for Mexican exports, means that they're going to be firing people, not hiring people, because unemployment goes with losing your export. Finally, the return of millions of Mexicans not only means people coming for work that isn't there, joining their own unemployed compatriots, but the end of the workers here means the end of the flow of remittances, which has been an important part of Mexican economics. That means you are plunging Mexico into an economic catastrophe. Oh, good. That's what you want on a country you have a 1,000-mile border with, from who you haven't been able to stop the flow of immigrants before. You are creating a situation where millions of Mexicans are going to try harder to get into the United States if you do this stuff than they did before. And your crappy wall won't stop them any more than it did before. So these are policies that are designed, well, let's put it this way. I don't think they're designed for anything. These are theater pieces. You see, I'm a president who's going to do better for America by sticking it to the people who aren't. Those folks in Panama are overcharging us. I'm going to take... You know what this is? An impotent giant thrashing around because he can't stop the decline, and he got into office as promising to do something for the people already suffering. It's great theater. It got him into that office, but it isn't going to solve any problem. And the poor idiot is sitting up there going to preside over his own undoing, which is what he did the first time, and he'll do it again.
Well, Richard uses the term theater piece, and I was thinking earlier today that there's a wonderful metaphor for what's happening. It's a movie piece, and probably Richard's the only one of us who's old enough to remember the Bing Crosby, Bob Hope road movies of the 1940s and 50s. And Bing and Bob were two song and dance con men who would go to foreign countries trying to take advantage of the natives. And they'd always find themselves in some scrape. And Bing would get out of it by selling Bob as a slave to some Arab as the road to Monaco. In 1942 was that. He promised Bob that he'd buy him back, and Bob went along with all these plans. In every movie, Bob Hope was the fall guy, and Bing would end up as the con man's leader, who would always sort of make a plan and pull him out. And because this was Hollywood, there was a Hollywood ending, and they'd all escape together with what they'd stolen or taken from the victims. Well, it's like we've seen a series of diplomatic road meetings with regard to the United States and Germany, where Germany's playing the Bob Hope victim character. The U.S. has sold out Germany, its industry, by destroying Nord Stream, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz went along with this, agreed to it all. spending, and other countries have gone along. And it looks you now have the head of the European Union, von der Leyen, saying, yes, of course we should pay 5% of our GDP for military, because she knows that most of this is going to be paid to the United States for exports of military arms, because German industry is pretty much dismantled. Even though the war, as your other guests have shown, the U.S. arms have not done very well, and the American, German, and other tanks have been blown up very quickly. Trump basically, he told today, the Davos Economic Forum, that's the clip I wished you'd shown. He said, I want to quote, "My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you anything. We will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth," unquote. Otherwise, if they try to continue to produce at home and other countries their goods and don't shift their production to the United States, their products are going to be charged tariffs that Trump has talked about, 20%. So it's as if Trump is saying to Germany, sorry, your enterprises have quadrupled, come to America and get them for almost as low a price as you were paying Russia before you elected leaders to let us cut off Nord Stream. But I'm glad that Richard mentioned Mexico. That indeed is a problem. And let's look at the balance of payments effects of this are most important. The imports from Mexico, from the United States, are basically from a whole ribbon along the border between them. And the U.S.-Mexico policy really was pushed forward by the neoliberal President Carter, who said, we've got to keep American wage levels down. What do? Let's promote trade with Mexico. And under Carter, the American companies began to set up small affiliates all along the line, maquiladoras, where workers would come, they were assembly plants, and workers would take all of the manufactured parts and assemble them into goods and sell them to the United States. And this was a major source not only of Mexican dollar revenue, but to corporate profits, because corporate profits said, thanks to President Carter, we can now employ low-cost Mexican labor instead of having to pay Americans where there's a minimum wage. Well, then came Bill Clinton with NAFTA, and NAFTA formalized the free trade area, North American free trade area with Mexico and Canada. And you had this maquiladora, low-wage labor making goods for American parent companies take place. And the counterpart to this in Canada was the Auto Pact. The Auto Pact was back in the 1970s. There was an argument over who's going to benefit from making American automobiles, and the American companies, car companies, established affiliates mainly in Windsor, a Canadian city right across the river from Detroit. And so they basically, there was an argument, I won't say an agreement, it's called an agreement, but really there was a dictated arrangement where the Canadian companies would make the auto parts that would go into the cars, and the parent auto companies in Detroit and elsewhere would would put these assembled parts into the finished automobiles. So all of this was part of the auto companies' attempt to buy low-priced Canadian labor. And the price of Canadian labor to the American companies kept falling and falling and falling, not because Canadian wage levels were going down, but because the Canadian dollar was going down as a result of Canadian financial policy and U.S. financial policy. So the U.S. found that when you could get countries with depreciating currencies, that was a way of getting more and more low-cost imports, and these imports from Canadian auto parts and Mexico's maquiladoras were not competing with American exports. They were making American exports to other countries more competitive because they were not made by high-priced American minimum wages, but by even lower wages to Mexicans and Canadians. That is what Trump is threatening to interfere with. And so, with seemingly without recognition, he has two choices. Either he's going to say, well, of course, we'll make an exception for the maquiladoras and for Canadian autos because they're not really imports. They're part of the U.S. economy. Northern Mexico and southern Canada are really part of the U.S. economy, and so we won't tax them. Well, this kind of favoritism would be so blatant to other countries that it would destroy the whole U.S. narrative of promoting free trade, democracy, and the free market. So I don't think Trump knows the intricacies of exactly how much America is gaining. I was in Ottawa when the auto pact was going through, and I can assure you that the Canadian politicians were very resentful, but they felt there's nothing they can do. Well, what can they do now if all of a sudden there will be mass unemployment in Canadians? I can't imagine that the auto companies would have so little leverage over the Trump administrations that they'd say, we've got to stop producing cars because our imports of the assembled parts that go into the cars now have to pay such a high tariff, 20%, that there's no way we can export our cars in competition with those of Europe or China, especially Europe, because the European currencies are going down as they have to spend more and more money on arms for NATO. That's going to force their currencies down. Their trade balance will go down. The currency exchange rates are going down. And so these financial instabilities are going to backfire on the United States, which rarely takes into account how other countries are going to respond to U.S. economic aggression.
No, they can't, because in order to sustain the theater of Mr. Trump, he has to be able to bloviate about taking the Panama Canal and subordinating these. He can't ask, let alone answer the question, what are these countries going to do in response if we do all these things? It's as if he controls everything, and it's just been a matter of having the courage to do what his predecessors didn't do, which, by the way, is how he talks. He imagines that they didn't have America first. Of course they did. There's nothing new about saying America first. Nothing new about saying it, nothing new about trying to do it. The problem is, as we are going through here, the things he says he's going to do have open-ended contradictory consequences right across the board. Let me give you another one from the clip you just played. When he says to the assembled Davos dignitaries, come to America. You can come to a place where we'll have the lowest taxes in the world. All right, now let me translate that. He's inviting them and he's making them a promise. And that promise is either to provide them with these lowest taxes in the world by stopping spending on the social programs that Americans need, and that's probably what he means, or he's going to go even further into deficit, which he has promised not to do, in his budgets. Otherwise, he can't deliver the lowest taxes in the world. Come on. If the American people paid attention, they'd realize he's telling the rest of the world, come here because we're going to give you, in fact, not just the lowest taxes, but we're going to compete on wage levels with the rest of the world. Because unless he does, they're not going to come. just as they haven't come before. They didn't come here because it doesn't pay. The wages here remain much too high, and the market is not growing anywhere near fast enough. If they hadn't been that way, we would have seen the arrival of large numbers of manufacturing jobs. We haven't seen anything of the sort. Let me be very blunt. Every one of the last dozen presidents has made the remark, often in their inauguration, how it's terrible how manufacturing has declined, and as they're committed to bringing manufacturing back. And manufacturing never came back because they didn't believe in it. Of course they did. Because they didn't try. Of course they did. But the economic truths of the system mean that capitalists around the world would be nuts to come here. This is a declining empire. This is a country divided politically with a level of hostility and animosity that ought to make you wonder. You spend a lot of money investing here, you've got a leader who will take that away from you whenever it's convenient. Look what he's doing to his close allies, to the countries that have done a lot for the United States, which is Canada, Mexico. I'll omit Greenland because that's not a serious proposition, or Panama. So you're not going to make big. That's why every president's invitation to manufacturers has gone unheeded. The percentage of our economy that's manufacturing is ridiculously low, has been at that and stayed at that across all the presidential bloviating to the contrary.
Well, I'm glad Richard mentions empire, because it's empire is much broader than just a set of bilateral relationships between America, North America, Europe, and other countries. There's every empire is really financial, and the key to America's imperial domination since 1945 has been financial. The dollar. And what Trump is threatening with his trade tariffs and sanctions is the entire system of international finance that is denominated in dollars. And I can explain this, partly because of America's already trade policy, but also because of the Federal Reserve raising of interest rates. As we've discussed before in this show, the dollar is going way up against other currencies. Not only Mexico, the Canadian dollar is going way down as a result. Global South countries and other countries. All of these countries are falling behind in their debt service. And Mexico and Canada, especially Mexico, is going to be the canary in the gold mine about what is breaking up the whole dollar system that underpins the American empire. You may not remember that in 1982, it was Mexico's default on its short-term bonds, its peso bonos, that triggered the whole Latin American debt bomb of the 1980s. Once Mexico said we cannot afford to pay debt unless we impose such drastic austerity that there's going to be unemployment and our party will be voted out of power. Because any party that follows that puts the interests of creditor nations first in being paid over its own industrial politics and welfare of its own population is going to be voted out of office, unless, of course, you're in Romania, Georgia, or Germany, where Angelina Baerbock has said it doesn't matter what voters say, we're here and we're going to fight Russia. But for most countries, they can't afford that luxury of saying we are independent of elections, and if they vote against us, we'll just nullify the election. American style, or National Endowment of Democracy style. What is going to be the result if Trump would really do what he's threatening to do against Mexico? Mexico would have to say, since we can't pay the foreign debts, we're suspending payment on the foreign debts. This is pretty much what happened in 1931 when the Allies and Germany, all of Europe, said we can't afford to pay the debts that America insisted on charging us for the arms he sold us before World War I. That forced us to impose reparations on Germany, and we're broke. We're going to have a moratorium. We're going to stop all of this. Same thing, very much like the Brady bombs in the 1970s. Other countries will say that Trump's trade policies have made it impossible to pay the dollar debts that are owed by countries that no longer can earn the money to pay the debts by exporting to the United States. And what is being violated is the moral principle that has underlain the whole, not only the U.S. Economic empire, but underlaid Britain's economic empire in the 19th century. The deal was that if other countries were going to let you dominate them financially and denominate the money that they borrowed, either in British sterling in the 19th century or dollars in the 20th century, that Britain and America had to promise to let them import enough of their goods to earn the sterling or the dollars to pay the debts. And America violated that immediately in 1921-22. As soon as Germany suffered the hyperinflation and its currency exchange rate began to go down as a result of having to pay reparations to the Allies to pay their debts to the United States, the Congress passed a tariff against countries with depreciating currencies, namely Germany. So they blocked Germany from earning the dollars to pay the hard currency to pay the Allies to pay their debts to the United States. So there was a big, by the 1928, 27 and 28, there was a big argument over the whole system of American financial demands on Europe. And John Maynard Keynes said that the only logic defending a creditor nation or a creditor economy, such as the United States, was enabling countries to pay their debts by exporting to it. And he said this again when at Bretton Woods in 1944, when the International Monetary Fund was being described. He said that there has to be, you have to prevent a country who's a creditor from taking actions to block other countries from exporting to the United States. And so he developed the Bancor, that if a country like the United States would be a chronic creditor country, and a country like Britain would be a chronic debtor, at a certain point that would be defined, the creditor claims would be wiped out along with the debtor claims. That was Keynes's principle, representing Britain, of course. And way back in 1809 and 1810, David Ricardo, who developed the entire theory, almost word for word, that's imposed by the International Monetary Fund today, austerity. Ricardo said, of course, other countries have to pay the creditor nation, and this will happen automatically. You don't have to do anything. Let the free market work, because the creditor nation, the debtor country, is going to pay money. That means it's going to lose its money supply by paying it to Britain. That means its prices will fall. And as prices and wages fall, their exports will be more competitive. And the money that's paid to Britain, its prices and wages are going to go up. Its exports are going to be more expensive and less competitive. And this is going to continue until the point where the debt-paying country automatically is able to build up its exports to supply to Britain. Well, that's junk economics, of course, but it's the junk economics that underlies the International Monetary Fund, and it underlies the American fiction of somehow an international economy working automatically in balance, even if there's military spending. And that was exactly what Ricardo was talking about during the Napoleonic Wars that were going on. Even military spending would automatically lead to adjustment mechanisms. Well, what Trump is doing is breaking up all the interconnections that have made these adjustment mechanisms work. And the only response from other countries can be, we've got to survive. And we have to put our own survival against paying the dollar debts that are owed not only to the United States banks and bondholders, but to our own oligarchies, like in Argentina, that owns probably most of the Argentine dollar debt is owed to its own oligarchy. That's why they loved Miley's strengthening of the dollar. It's making them rich while it makes the rest of Argentina poor. So you've created not only an international breakdown of trade and finance, you've also spread a class war throughout the various countries outside of the United States.
And that's a wonderful way to say the economics that you teach in the school that is informing Mr. Trump's advisors, may be giving him the idea based on a little model that they worked out when they were 12 years old, that if A happens, then B, then C, and then D. And all the rest of the universe is going to be quiet and not interfere in this nice A, B, C, D story. I mean, that's how I was taught in the university. And I knew as a student that this was nuts, that this was fantasy, that these relations, and you know, the history of economics is people who come along and say, that truism, here's 6 examples where it didn't work, and blows it up and gets a good job doing that. And then unfortunately sinks back into doing more of those little models as if he didn't learn from his own success. It's silly. You can't do the game Mr. Trump is playing. But you know, maybe there's a deeper wisdom. Maybe Mr. Trump knows somewhere. And I understand this is a reach, but he knows somewhere what kind of a hustler he is. And that his job is to stay in office. And all this theater is to stay in office. I'm the unusual one. I do the naughty thing. I started my career by calling Mexicans rapists, and I will continue my career by snatching the Panama Canal away from that country. I'm going to pit the United States with its nuclear arsenal against all 11 members of the Panamanian military. You know, the absurdities of what he's doing, the outlandish behavior, you know, it's going to lead Americans at some point to say, you know, if you have a problem with the rate structure of ships passing through the canal, what you do is call for a meeting, send your foreign minister, have a conference, raise a question, solicit proposal. What do you jumped over all of the rest to threaten people. This will not be forgotten. If he proceeds, he's going to be in trouble. If he drops it, it will not be forgotten. What is this about? This is a man who's presiding over a sinking ship. But to avoid the other people noticing, he keeps saying, look at how we came over this wave. Look at how we're overcoming this wave. Yeah, sir, but the ship is sinking. Oh no, look at how well we got over that one. This, as you said earlier, Nima, about another historical period, I think, this doesn't end well. It never has. It is hard for an economy and an empire to decline. I understand that. But the best way to do it is to face it and to sit down with the others on this planet to work out a way to make that a livable experience for all of us, not a shouting match, heaving threats of deportation, tariffs, punishments, withdraw. My God, what a statement of weakness this all is.
Well, that all seems to end well, Richard. I like the fact that you've got personal and called Trump a hustler. That's exactly what how he's made his fortune. He will he's making a threat to attack other countries. He will do big tariffs unless you do what I want. He usually makes a big demand, and so he's really just he knows that they're not going to go along with this. What he does think is that, okay, they'll settle for 50% of what I'm asking. That's how, as a real estate developer, he treated his suppliers. He wouldn't pay them. He'd pay. The normal policy of his was to offer them 50, say, well, I paid half. Well, I didn't like your work so much. Here's half. Or he, no matter whether he was dealing with suppliers or subcontractors or consultants, he'd always end up paying them half after promising them the full thing. I think that's a strategy with Europe. He's trying to frighten Europe and Canada and other countries and trying to see how much they're going to protest and how much they'll actually say, okay, well, we will give you this much. And this much is what Trump has wanted all along. And the surrendering to Trump, therefore, as you pointed out, Richard, would have to come at the cost of a class war in Europe, because if Europe follows its directives not to run budget deficits, and it's spending more, it's more than doubling its military spending, it has to cut back social spending. And the strongest response of Europe isn't to give in. It's simply to call his bluff. They can say, yes, impose your tariffs, and this is going to hurt U.S. customers, first of all, because your prices are going to go way up, and there goes your the inflation that you promised to cure. On the other hand, the neoliberals, the billionaires that Trump brought to his coronation, want a class war. That's their ideology. They want a European MAGA. Make America, make Europe a low-wage country again. Make them into Mexico. Make them into what we had dreamed that China would become. That basically is what he's trying to settle for, and they don't have to settle. Just like Mexico doesn't have to say, well, okay, you've vastly reduced our ability to earn dollars, but we're still going to pay the debts anyway, because paying debts is a sacred assumption, and that comes that's the prime directive, even before developing our own economy and raising our own standards of living. That's exactly the choice that he's forcing the other countries into. You'd pointed out that seems to be a bad choice if they succumb. But if they decide this is an impossible choice for us to make, then it'll be a good outcome, because they will find, okay, Trump has pushed the American empire to such a critical mass of greed that we've got to all join together with the BRICS and can create an alternative economy.
Yeah, and I think that the rest of the world is more and more bringing to an end, in a wonderful Hegelian way, the effort since the Second World War of the United States to isolate and extinguish communism, socialism, Russia, China, and the ends up it's isolating itself. It's making itself, if the future is green and Mr. Trump is successful in getting rid of all the subsidies here, then all the rest of the world will produce green machines and green alternatives. And then when Americans want them, they'll have to buy them outside the country. And that will shape our economy because of our dependence on imports. It's like the story with the electric vehicles. America's future is now in the hands of the Chinese because they're developing and constantly improving what is already the best electric vehicle. I mean, this is going to be repeated over and over, and it shouldn't surprise the United States because that's how the United States did it out of its infancy. My God, there's a level of historical amnesia lurking around these conversations that's really scary because it suggests yet again the horror of looking at your actual circumstance and the choice of fantasy and self-delusion as the alternative and electing the most ambitious self-deluder of them all. You see Mr. Biden and Kamala Harris, unable quite to equal. They are the products of when it wasn't necessary to do that, which is why the average people who suffered under them hate them and won't vote for them anymore.
Well, Trump's delusion that you're referring to has underlain American diplomacy since 1945. And that delusion is that America is the exceptional nation because we're entirely self-sufficient in raw materials, in energy, in agriculture. We can feed itself, and they assume manufacturing as well. The illusion is precisely that America is self-sufficient. So if it smashes up the international economic order like Trump is threatening to do, it can survive because it can pull itself together, and other countries will be so disrupted that American companies can go in and buy up foreign countries at a pennies on the dollar, or certainly at a big discount, and the economy will be turned into a grab bag. Well, the fact is that underlying all of this is Trump's imagining that he can make America an industrial power again. That's his big mistake. He doesn't realize that we're not in American industrial capitalism anymore. We're in American finance capitalism, and finance capitalism is not very friendly towards industry. It makes its money by carving up industry, breaking it up, selling it off in parts, and moving its labor force abroad, outsourcing its labor. And I don't think there's a realization, not only in Trump, but in any of the American diplomats, just how America has undercut its economy, and it's focused on what Marx called the sphere of circulation: money, interest, rent, charging, but not on profits, wages, and the actual expenses of making an industrial agricultural economy as a whole. It's hollowed itself out. That's what is not realized by the United States. And other countries also are naive enough to think that somehow they don't have the upper hand in resisting American policy because America will fall apart faster than they do if they stick together with each other and are mutually supportive and with a complementary agricultural, industrial, raw materials production.
Yeah. Richard.
There is a deep sadness in me, really. I mean it. I was born in this country. I've lived here and worked here all my life. And I appreciate what Michael is trying to get across to us. There is a deep sadness in the kind of hysterical self-delusion that's going on here. I keep reading, apropos of what we talked before, because I had to do with Yale University a part of my life, I get literature, and they have a program for corporate executives, the leader of which writes these pieces that are wild. Russia's falling apart. We don't have to worry. By the end of this year, they'll stop the war in Ukraine because they're falling apart. You know what this looks like and sounds like? It's a person who's kind of lost their connection with the world and are living in a dream world. And you kind of understand them because perhaps they're ill or perhaps, something traumatic has happened to them. And so they make it all up as they go. Every weapon that Mr. Zelensky could think of, he asked for. And in the end, every weapon he asked for, short of nuclear, was given to him. We weren't going to give him the Abrams tank. We did. We weren't going to give him the F-16s. We did. We weren't going to give him the missiles. We did. We weren't going to give him a permission to shoot the missiles deep into Russia. We did. And every time he made that plea, he said, what you've given me so far hasn't worked, which we all knew because we could see where the Russian army was compared to where it was last month, last year. So we all know it hasn't worked. But we are listening to people. Look at that clip. He's going to go to have a meeting soon with Mr. Putin, and he's going to threaten him with what? Sanctions? That's a total failure. That's why we saw the table you put before. The sanctions have allowed Russia to grow faster than it used to and faster than the United States. It is an illusion to throw more sanctions. What are you doing? And at a certain point, you stop being irritated and angry, and you become kind of sad for people that are now so deeply underwater that all they can do is gurgle the nonsense that didn't work because they don't have anything else. They have nothing to sit down and talk to Mr. Putin about. Mr. Putin is a very popular leader in his country. His army is winning the war. He is not going to change because that's been a successful policy. The effort to get China to act more like the United States has been going on since Nixon and Kissinger went there. That hasn't worked. The Chinese, to the surprise of no one, having a system that has grown faster than any country on earth for 30 years, isn't about to change that because that would be lunacy. So either you face this or you start disconnecting from the world and live in a fantasy. My wife is a psychotherapist. I talk to her a lot. This is a country in what those folks call denial. It's when a human being has such difficulty facing a personal problem or a health problem, and so it magically goes away by pretending it's not there. And you know what? That has never solved the problem ever.
Well, the question is whether this is really an illusion or whether it's part of a narrative that they know is not realistic, but they're hoping and convincing the rest of the world that it works. My wife is also a psychotherapist,
Yes.
and she sees how manipulators try to create an illusion in their victims that of something that isn't really real, but they're trying to frame how to look at a given problem in a distorted way. And I think the function of the American media, the New York Times, the television, NBC, and the others, is to try to promote an illusion that somehow Russia is losing, that America is winning. Therefore, you should support the existing neocon, neoliberal group in power for as long as they can. they know that it's going to break in time. I think they realize that this can't go on, that it'll break, but they're trying to hold on to the last year, the last minute, as long as they can keep grabbing what they can before they say time to take the money and run.
Yeah. I think we can wrap it up right now. Thank you so much, Richard and Michael, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Okay.
We'll
Thank
see you
you
next
all
week.
both. Thank you as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.